In 2015, the Syrian civil war was raging, with the conflict being dominated by a group that I can't say the name on YouTube because Susan Mukiki or whoever is the Indian CEO of YouTube now will my harder than Luigi. The IMS was a vicious faction, known throughout the world for its numerous crimes, such as being opposed to the World Economic Forum and not supporting LGBT rights. Still, the IMS was at its strongest point thus far and had yet to suffer a single major defeat. The next target of al-Baghdadi's wrath were the Kurdish forces in the Kobani region. Kobani was supposed to be one of the first targets of the IMS's offensive in northern Syria, but they had to postpone it from late 2014 to early 2014, after they had already publicly announced to the world that they were going to attack there, just like the Ukrainian army did in Zaporozhye. This, however, would have little effect on the outcome of the offensive, as the IMS blitzed through Kurdish positions regardless, capturing multiple villages and encircling Rojava troops in the city of Ain al-Arab, commonly known as Kobani, which is also the name of the region, which makes things a bit more confusing. By the 5th of October, they had reached the eastern and southern entrances of the city, unaliving and committing surprise mating sections to civilians in the territories they had captured thus far. However, IMS forces were ambushed in their attempts to penetrate the city, and were even pushed back in eastern Kobani after a joint attack from the United States airstrikes, followed by a Kurdish counteroffensive. The fighting intensified as both sides would lose, capture, and recapture the same territory in the span of hours, with both the Kurds and the IMS resorting to self-unalived bombings, and Rojava losing the eastern portion of the city again, just as FSA reinforcements arrived to fight on their side. IMS forces launched an offensive against the central area of the city, capturing the headquarters of the Kurdish forces and advancing in the western neighborhoods as well. By the 13th of October, IMS held around 50% of the city, and would launch attacks directed at the Kurdish forces defending the border crossing, that if captured by the IMS, would force a Kurdish retreat or would lead to their army being encircled, cut off, and then slaughtered. The United States would then try to airdrop equipment to the Kurds, but they accidentally airdropped the guns in IMS-held territory, thus giving their enemies more guns to kill their allies. IMS would launch another offensive against the border crossing, and then again, and then again, and then again, but were repelled every single time. At this point, IMS troops were exhausted, and the Kurds saw this as the perfect moment to launch their own offensives. By November 12, the Kurds had already expelled IMS troops from a great portion of the southern area of the city, recapturing the road and supply routes that connected Kobani to the IMS headquarters in the city of Hakka, leading to a series of offensives, sealing the IMS's defeat and forcing them to retreat from the city. The total Kurdish victory at Kobani city would cause them to recapture most of the Kobani region, as the IMS offered no resistance as they had already retreated from there. The other factions of the civil war would react differently to this massive victory, as the Syrian government apologized as they expressed they wanted to help the Kurds against IMS, but couldn't because their jets were at a risk of violating Turkish airspace since the city was so close to the Turkish border. The Syrian rebels, on the other hand, were absolutely pissed, as they were jealous of all the equipment and support the Kurds were getting from the West, while they were only getting hashtags on Twitter and a box full of condoms. Upon hearing of the mistreatment of minorities by the evil West Asians wearing black, the United States initiated Operation Inherent Resolve, an international coalition of NATO allies to stop the IMS in Syria, Iraq, and Libya. This coalition would mostly resort to airstrikes, but would also send a limited amount of personnel and military equipment to its allies in Syria, mostly the Kurds in Rojava. You may be asking, what about the FSA? Well, the US just kinda forgot about them, most likely because they were perceived as unreliable allies. Not only did they have the most infighting of all of the Syrian factions, but lots of the equipment the CIA would send to the FSA would magically reappear in the black market, which would then be bought by the IMS, and the IMS would use those weapons against the FSA and other United States allies. The USA seemed to ignore the FSA so much that they decided to make their own rebel group from scratch, named the Revolutionary Commando Army, formed mostly by veterans of the Southern Rebel Army assisted by US Marines. This would coincide with the Russians starting their own intervention in the war by supporting the Syrian government with airstrikes and deploying the Wagner Group, a Russian PMC led by Yevgeny Prigozhin, science bless his soul. The Syrian Arab army, despite being at its lowest point in territorial terms due to rebel and jihadist offensives, would make a massive comeback with their counteroffensive against the FSA in Aleppo. I haven't talked that much about the Battle of Aleppo in the series because it is so goddamn long. Like, this battle lasted a total of 4 years, making it one of the longest battles in modern history. And I thought it would be too distracting if I were to just stop talking about whatever, just to give news about the changes in the Battle of Aleppo. But basically, the government was encircled by the rebels for like 3 years, then they launched a counteroffensive that said "no you," and then the rebels got encircled and they died immediately. Now that you think about it, the Syrian army seems to be talented in the art of getting encircled for years and then winning somehow. It happened in Aleppo, it happened in Al-Hasaka, and it also happened in Deir ez-Zor, as the governments launched Operation Lavender, which pushed the IMS and the RCA out of central Syria, liberating the boys encircled in Deir ez-Zor that were fighting there for years at this point. The next 3 years would mark the beginning of the end for the IMS. The Kurds would launch further advances against IMS as they captured large chunks of territory and scored a major victory in the Battle of Hakka, which sealed the fate of IMS in Syria, just as they were also recently expelled from Iraq during the Mosul offensive led by the Iraqi army and US forces. Just as things were looking incredible for everyone else, everything seemed to be going wrong for the FSA. Not only did they lose the Battle of Aleppo and American support, they were now also going through a civil war within a civil war, as the Islamist faction of the group seceded and proclaimed the creation of the Syrian Salvation Government, performing attacks and skirmishes against the FSA until Turkey told them to cut it off. Turkey seemed so frustrated with the FSA's inability to do anything that they decided to do the dirty work themselves and conducted Operation Euphrates Shield, where they established military outposts in Syrian rebel territory and invaded Rojava, securing a large stretch of land where they may or may not conduct ethnic cleansings to this day. The Syrian regime, in response, didn't give a shit about the presence of up to 20,000 Turkish soldiers and launched an offensive anyways, where they actually fucking won against Turkey and the Syrian rebels, until Russia, Syria, and Turkey agreed to a ceasefire in the Idlib region. Assad also cleaned up these pockets of rebels in the south, so I can finally fix this border gore. Since then, the front line has changed little if at all, and the Syrian civil war is considered a frozen conflict like the Korean War, for example. And by the way, this war is never going to end.